Welcome everyone, my name is Adam Weezer and I will be your host this week for another installment of Loremaker's Guide to the Galaxy. For those unfamiliar, this is a show where a member of the lore team sits down and walks you through a specific star system, tells you a bit of the history, some of the stories that have occurred there, some of the science and other little tidbits about it. So you can kind of get educated on the entire galaxy that you'll be exploring in the PU and enjoying in Squadron 42. So this week we're going to go to an extremely important system for many reasons, a lot of them being historical and some just on its mere placement. It is one of only two systems that is directly connected to the Sol system. So as we look here on the map where we're starting, we're on Earth. And it's one of the systems we can just even pitch up here a little bit, and there you see the jump point that'll lead us to it. So today we are going to go and visit the Davian system. All right, so we're going to back out here. And as you can see, besides Croshaw, Davian is one of only two systems that is directly connected to Sol. Because of this, the Davian system is has notoriously difficult custom standards, just because not only is it one of the gateways to humanity's homeworld, it also lays on a very important and strategic trade route that connects Sol and Terra. So Sol and Terra, I believe, is like a five jump journey, which has to go through, which goes through the Davian system as kind of one of the quickest ways to get there. So let's zoom on in and take a bit of a closer look of this system. It's a 4-planet system with a K-type main sequence star at the center. Now, K-type main sequence stars are kind of like a yellowish-orangish in color, and they normally have an average surface temperature around 5,316 degrees Kelvin. Just for a point of reference, the sun at the heart of our system sits at 5,778 degrees Kelvin on average, so it's just a little bit cooler than what you would see in the Sol system. Now, Davian was first discovered in 2430 by Wendell Dopsy, who very smartly named the system after his father-in-law. It's like I said, it's got a 4-planet system, and I think the best way to actually break it down and kind of like explore it is to actually work it backwards. So we are going to start out here at the Davian 4. Let's zoom right on in. And Davian 4 is an ice giant that is renowned for having a very picturesque and beautiful atmosphere. Yet the most interesting thing about Davian 4 is actually what is in orbit around it, and that is the Banu Friendship Museum. Now, this is important, and even though the museum is hardly ever visited and seems to perennially be on the chopping block when it comes to government funding, it's still there, and it's still a very important part of UE history, because it was in the outer reaches of the Davian system that humanity made contact with the first aliens in their history. It was out here in 2438 that Vernon Tarr, an explorer, was searching the outer reaches for potential jump points. While doing this, he spotted a strange ship kind of following him, and just out of instinct, figuring that this was somebody trying to jump one of his potential claims, he shot at that ship. Luckily for all parties involved, he missed. And the pilot of that ship was a Banu who humanity would come to know and love, and called Jerry, who was piloting a Banu merchantman. Needless to say, Jerry was just as surprised as Wendell was that there was a new race out there, and it turned into a meeting, even though it started with shots fired across the bow. After the authorities were contacted, the UNE sent out a General Neil Sokolovich to come and deal directly with Jerry, and then the Banu delegation that was dispatched to the system shortly thereafter. Once humanity and the Banu were able to figure out how to communicate communicate together. It didn't take long. I think it was maybe a month or two before the first interstellar peace and trade accord was signed between humanity and the Banu. When this happened, this generated a lot of buzz within the UNE at the time, not only because there was obviously our first alien friends in the world, but also there was a lot of potential for trade. The Banu are huge traders, so people and corporations flooded to the Davian system in the hopes of doing deals with a whole new market. What was interesting, though, is that, and humanity did not discover this until years later as we back on out, is that Davian is actually nowhere near the Banu front. As you can see here, here's Davian, which is essentially probably we would consider it a core human world. But the Banu world, you can see I'm backing out here, and we're not even getting into the picture. We've got Geddon, we've got Bacchus here, so it's still a good deal away from Davian space. It turns out that Jerry, the pilot of the Banu merchantman, was also a fugitive from a few Banu guilds and had some people after him he did not want to have to deal with. It was because of this that he found himself so far away from Banu space. So even though a lot of people and a lot of corporations flooded the system in the hopes of making new alien friends, it was never quite to be, because Davian actually, in the grand scheme of things, didn't turn out to be on the edge of the Banu world. So let's go back in and let's move on closer to Davian 3. Now, this planet is a terrestrial smog planet with a very dangerous atmosphere filled with acid. So it's one of those you don't want to get too close, and humanity never really considered doing much with it because the acid is supposedly so strong that it can melt ship hulls. So while you may want to avoid it, there are often reports that crime syndicates in the Davian system use this planet to, let's say, dispose of objects, ships, people that maybe they don't want to be found. So if you do pass the system, be careful not only for its acidic atmosphere, but also for the type of people that do spend a lot of time around it. Now, moving on to Davian 2. This is really the heart and the soul of the Davian system. It's named Sestulus, and the main city that you'll be able to visit there is called Jeddah. Now, Sestulus was recognized in the early 25th century, and has been an important part of the empire ever since then. As I mentioned previously, when the Banu were first discovered, lots of corporations flooded to the system in hopes that this would be a great place to spend time and to meet the new alien race. One of those companies which you are all probably very familiar with is Aegis Dynamics, the ship company. Now, Aegis was originally a merger between two companies, which is Aegis Macrocomputing, which was an Earth-based company, and Dynamics Productions, which was actually based out here in Davian. And when they merged, they came together and they put their center of operation right here to be able to access the wider world. So when you visit Jeddah, you'll be able to go to the Aegis showroom and see the show floors and see a variety of their ships. Now, Aegis famously were the favorite ships of Ivar Messer, the despot that ruled the UEE whose family ruled the UEE for centuries. And because of this, they were popular with the military for a handful of centuries. But once the Messers were deposed, they quickly fell out of public favor and were almost seen as a symbol of that era. In the subsequent decades and centuries after the Messers went aside, a lot of these military ships that Aegis had built trickled down to the second-hand market and became extremely popular in certain civilian circles. Because of this popularity and because of the ship's performance and the stuff that they could do, Aegis has recently experienced an uptick and kind of a resurgence in popularity now that they've put enough distance between themselves and the Messer era. So yeah, going back to the early 26th century when this planet became first recognized, and when we say recognized in lore, that means that the planet gets an official name and it also gets voting rights in the Senate in the government Senate. And it didn't take long for Cestilus's political might to kind of come to bear. In 2525, their senator, Nomi Rao, stepped onto the floor and presented something that would become known as the Common Laws. Now, at the time, the UPE was struggling with how to govern an ever-expanding empire, where there was a diversity of opinions and government styles and lots of different factors. What the Common Laws proposed was a baseline of rights that any planet that wanted to join the wider government and become a voting member of the Senate would need to follow to basically achieve those, achieve that status. After a year of very vigorous debate, the Common Laws were passed. This allowed those planets and systems and local governments to basically govern themselves in whatever way they saw fit or was best suited for their planet, as long as they adhered to these common standards. The Common Laws are a very important piece of legislation and are considered one of the cornerstones of the government to this day. A few years after that happened, another incident occurred on Jeddah, in the city of Jeddah, that would be politically important also. After unifying under the Common Laws, the UPE decided it was time to unify the currency too, and thus the UEC was created. Now, not everyone was extremely happy with the fact that there was going to be one unified currency, and some even predicted that it could lead to economic collapse. The most vocal opposition actually occurred in rioting that on Jeddah during 2529. Now, this became known as the Siege of Jeddah, lasted 2 weeks, and actually required the UPE to deploy the military into the system to actually stop the riots. Hundreds were injured, even 2 police were killed, and the UPE military got a lot of flack for it taking so long. Now, one of the interesting reasons why the riots were able to last so long is that Jeddah, unlike many other places on the planet of Cestulus, are actually covered by biodomes. Now, these biodomes have become the iconic symbol when you'll see when you fly down over the city or when you look up into the sky when you're visiting Jeddah. And these biodomes are essential because when the UNE basically got bids to have companies terraform this planet, this being the only habitable planet in the Davian system, they awarded the bid to Babco GeoBuilders, who were a kind of young terraform company that won the bid not because of their sterling reputation, but just because they brought in the lowest bid. Now, at the time that the GeoBuilders built the terraform the planet, not everything went quite right, and it resulted in a very thin atmosphere. It's still breathable to humans, but it's, let's say, more equivalent to trying to live on the top of the Himalayas or the Andes or the Alps. It's something you could deal with, but is not ideal. So giant biodomes were built over many areas of the planet as a way to be able to more easily pump oxygen into the areas that humanity was taking over. Again, this happened right on the heels of people trying to come into the system and check out the Banu and all that stuff. So the idea of having to spend money to re-terraform the planet just doesn't make sense, and the biodomes was the solution. Now, how this factors in to the siege of Jeddah is that part of the reason why these riots lasted so long is that protesters had taken control over a series of the air purification units in the city of Jeddah, and the UPE military was concerned that these units could be turned off and possibly not help pump enough oxygen into the area, or even worse, that other chemicals or things could be pumped into the system through these units. So that was their justification for why the siege of Jeddah lasted for 2 whole weeks. Moving on to 2545, another extremely important historical event occurred here on Jeddah and involved the biodomes. At noon on December 15th of 2545, a series of strategically placed bombs exploded and actually crumbled the biodomes of Jeddah down onto the population below, killing hundreds. This was a travesty, and it was shocking to the entire empire. It was also the first of 6 bombing attacks that terrorized the UPE over the course of the next few months. Even though nothing was proven at the time, there were strong implications based on the materials used in the bomb that Shi'an terrorists were the ones responsible for it, which fed into the burgeoning Cold War between humanity and the Shi'an. At the time, the High General of the UPE government was one Ivar Messer, and he proposed something called the Prime Citizen. Now, what this was, it was a referendum that citizens voted on and eventually would pass, which would consolidate power of the government under one position, a prime citizen, also to become known as imperator. Prior to that, the UPE was governed by a triumvirate, which included the High General, which at the time was Ivar Messer, a High Secretary, and a High Advocate. Messer argued that the triumvirate was, as a political system, a political way of governance, was weak, it was ineffectual, it was slow to respond to emergencies, all points which seemed to be emphasized by the UPE's inability to track down who was causing these terrorist bombings all around the empire. Of course, after the Prime Citizen Initiative passed, Ivar Messer did ascend to the role of imperator, and his family would then go on to tyrannical rule over the coming centuries. It wasn't until 2806 that a Truth and Reconciliation Committee was finally put together to come to terms with the atrocities that happened during the Messer era. This was after the Messer family had been officially deposed. And one of the people who spent time digging through the archives of all the information that was released in the Truth and Reconciliation Committee was a researcher and a scholar, rhetoric-based scholar by the name of Sidney Carmack, who was always obsessed with the bombing campaigns that had basically led to the Prime Citizen plan being adopted. Now, as she started to dig through details, she uncovered some new information which had never been seen before, which she published in a book called The Path to the Prime Citizen, which became a bestseller and basically implicated Ivar Messer as the orchestrator of these terrorist bombing campaigns. Now, Sidney Carmack was able to pull this thread through based on evidence she found coming back here to Jeddah. So in the days prior to the explosions that collapsed the biodomes, a man by the name of Cyrus Ishitaka was arrested in a slam sting in Jeddah. Later that night, he was very quickly and very quietly released from jail without much reason except for one name which could be tied back to an Adam Kor. Now, Sidney Carmack, as a researcher, recognized these names because Cyrus Ishitaka and Adam Kor were both soldiers that fought alongside Ivar Messer during the Battle of Idrisfor. Adam Kor was an infiltration expert, and Cyrus Ishitaka was a demolition expert. She was able to follow the connection through even more thoroughly by noting that Cyrus Ishitaka could be tracked to 5 out of the 6 planets in the days prior to the terrorist attacks that occurred there. Cyrus Ishitaka's fate actually is a pretty sad one. He was discovered shot dead in a New York City alley days after the final bombing did occur. Reports of this of the autopsy around his death were sealed. It was wiped under the rug as a slam deal gone wrong. But the Truth and Reconciliation Council basically released this detail too, and it was found that Cyrus Ishitaka actually had trace amounts of Shi'an explosive under his fingernails in the autopsy. Adam Kor, the other member, was a complete ghost during this time, during the terrorist campaigns. But he did very fortuitously suddenly surface after Ivar Messer became elected prime citizen, because Ivar Messer then appointed Adam Kor a prominent role in the UEE military. Now again, while none of this can be definitively proven, it is considered by many and is almost public belief at this point that Ivar Messer did orchestrate these bombing campaigns to ascend to the prime citizen. Now, another fun little thing about the planet of Sestilis here, besides Aegis Dynamics having its main headquarters here, it can also be considered the birthplace, in a strange way, to Apocalypse Arms, the ship's weapon manufacturing company that you should be familiar with already, and can fire their guns and Arena Commander in some of the games right now. So in 2792, Dalton Colabello, who was a construction magnate and a collector of antique military replicas, bought this strange crate at an auction at a Davian warehouse. When he got home, he opened the crate, and inside he found 2 prototypes of weapons that he had never seen before. Now, Colabello just became obsessed with figuring out the history of these weapons and spent the next few years of his life consulting experts and trying to track down exactly where they came from. So it turns out that these weapons were built by a former Aegis engineer by the name of Juliet Malpin. She was put in contact with Linton Messer the 11th, who was the last Messer to rule the UEE. Now, Linton Messer understood at that time that the walls were closing in on their dictatorship, and he was growing concerned that there might be a rebellion against him. As his way to kind of ensure against that, he decided he needed a new line of extremely powerful ship weapons built to defend himself in case of this occurrence. Through some back channels, engineer Juliet Malpin was put in contact with him and went off to design these weapons. Now, she understood that working with the Messer government in such a politically sensitive time could be problematic, and because of that, she snuck away and did her work in secret using a variety of shell companies to hide what she was doing. When she finished her prototype, she put him in this case and sent him off to Messer. And while they were in transit, the massacre of Garen occurred, which was basically the tipping point, which basically deposed Linton Messer and the entire Messer family from control of the UEE. That crate with those 2 prototypes was then stuck in this Davian warehouse and sat there for decades until Dalton Colabello finally picked it up and bought it. Now, Colabello was able to track Malpin, who, after the fall of the Messers, fled to the Coral system, where she worked there and still had relatives, and was able to even track down some of her old notes and diagrams and plans for these weapons. He has since used those to basically start Apocalypse Arms and sell these weapons to the public, even bragging that these were weapons intended for the Messers, but that the Messers never got to use. To him, this is a success story. The Messers created these extremely powerful weapons, but were never able to use them, but now you can. So that's how he's kind of spun his sales pitch on the history behind these weapons. Finally, just one other personal note I want to add here. I know I've been talking about Sestilis a lot, but Sestilis here is, and Jeddah in particular, is the home to Elroy Cass. Now, any of you who read the lore know that Elroy Cass is a frequent guest in the Star Watch post, which tracks the star and celebrity culture of 2946 UEE. And Elroy Cass, let's say, is the misfit extraordinaire of the era so far. I like to personally think of him as the Keith Richards of our universe, the one who can out-party and outlast and somehow outlive everyone despite doing some of the most hardcore things out there. So just wanted to tip my cap very, very slightly to Jeddah being the home of Elroy Cass, the infamous Davian Deviant. And one more planet here in the system for you to check out. This is Davian 1. which is a rocky terrestrial world, has no minerals on it, it has no core. It's probably best compared to our moon. But yeah, just another little rock circling close here to Davian's K-type star. So that concludes this week's episode of Lore Maker's Guide to the Galaxy. I'm Adam Weezer. This has been the Davian System, and I'll see you around the verse.